You ever watch something collapse in real time and realize you're the one who pulled the first thread? Because that's exactly what happened at 11:06 a.m. when the laughter stopped and the sound of metal scraping against mud cut through the music like a bad signal. And I was standing there on the shoreline with the smell of wet earth rising up where 30 feet of water used to sit just hours earlier, watching a $1 million floating restaurant settle into the lake bed like it had always belonged there. Except it didn't, because that lake was mine and had been mine since 1978 when my grandfather signed the original water rights deed with hands that still smelled like engine oil and cedar dust. And I remember the way he used to stand at the edge of that water, boots sunk into gravel, telling me that land you can fence, but water you have to understand, you have to respect it, or it'll turn on you. And for years I did exactly that. I studied it, mapped every inch, every inflow, every outflow, every pressure point in the dam that sat quietly at the north end like it was just another piece of dirt, when in reality, it was the only thing holding back 2.3 million gallons of controlled silence. And 12 years ago, I was the one who redesigned that system, calibrated the spillway, reinforced the gate, signed off on every valve that could raise or lower that lake by inches per hour if you knew what you were doing, which I did. And that's why when I came back last Thursday and smelled diesel before I even saw the shoreline, I knew something was wrong. Because that lake doesn't smell like fuel. It smells like algae and summer heat and still mornings. But instead I heard generators humming and drills whining and voices echoing across water that didn't belong to them. And when I stepped through the tree line, I saw it. A full-scale floating platform anchored dead center, steel frame, polished decking, branded banners flapping in the wind like they'd already won, and workers moving like it was just another job site, like they had every right to be there. And that's when she walked into view, Victoria Hargrove, white linen outfit, sunglasses bigger than her patience, holding a clipboard like it was a badge of authority, smiling that tight, controlled smile that says she's already decided how this story ends. And she looked at me like I was the problem standing in the way of progress, like I was just some local inconvenience. And when I asked her what she thought she was doing on my lake, she didn't even blink, just said it plain and slow like I needed help understanding. "This is a community development project, Mr. Caldwell. You should have checked your notices." And that's when the taste of iron hit the back of my tongue, because I hadn't received anything. No permit request, no lease, no agreement. Nothing but the reality sitting in front of me that somehow, somewhere, they thought they could build on water they didn't own and get away with it. And I watched as workers tightened bolts into a structure that wasn't anchored to land, wasn't anchored to law, just floating on borrowed space. And behind her I saw the sign already printed, grand opening. Saturday, 12 p.m., lakefront dining experience. And the way she said lakefront, like it belonged to her, told me everything I needed to know, because she wasn't guessing. She was certain, and people who are that certain usually think they've closed every door, covered every angle, and standing there with the hum of generators and the smell of hot metal drifting across water I'd spent my whole life protecting. I realized something else, something she didn't, something nobody on that platform understood yet, because while they were busy building something that floated, they never once stopped to ask what it was floating on, and that was the only part of this entire situation I actually controlled. The next morning the air felt different, heavier, like the lake itself was holding its breath, and I stood on the old wooden dock with my boots pressed into damp boards, staring out at that floating platform as the sun came up behind it, turning polished steel into something almost respectable if you did not know better. And for a second I understood how they sold it, how they convinced people this was progress. Because from a distance it looked clean, organized, profitable, but up close I could hear the low hum of generators vibrating through the water, feel the unnatural ripple patterns hitting the shoreline at angles that did not belong. And it bothered me in a way I could not ignore, like a machine running out of sync with its own design. And that was the thing about water. It always tells you when something is wrong if you know how to listen. And I had spent most of my life listening, measuring, adjusting, learning the way pressure builds and releases, the way flow changes with just a fraction of an inch. And as I watched workers secure the final sections of that platform, I could already see the imbalance, the weight distribution off by just enough to matter if conditions changed. And that thought sat in the back of my mind, while Victoria's voice carried across the lake again, directing people like she owned not just the land but the air above it. And I walked the perimeter that afternoon, following the shoreline the way my grandfather taught me, checking the feeder creek on the west side where the water entered, noticing the diversion pipe they had installed without permission, pulling just enough flow to keep their structure stable no matter what the natural level did. And that was when the quiet anger settled in, not loud, not explosive, just precise, because they had not only taken space, they had started altering the system itself. And systems do not forget changes like that, they react. And I crouched down near the inlet, running my fingers through the current, feeling the reduced pull, calculating without needing a single instrument how much volume they were redirecting every hour. And it confirmed what I already suspected. They were not planning for temporary use. They were building something permanent on something they did not understand. And later that evening I pulled out the original documents, spread them across my kitchen table. The old paper still holding that faint dry smell of storage and time. And there it was, the clause most people skip because it looks like standard language, emergency release authority, full control retained by the primary rights holder in cases of structural or environmental risk. And I sat there for a long moment, just staring at that line, hearing my grandfather's voice in the back of my mind telling me that control is not about what you use every day. It is about what you can use when everything goes wrong. And outside I could still hear the distant echo of construction finishing up, laughter drifting across the water as if the lake had already been rewritten into something else. And I realized that to them this was just a surface, something to build on, something to decorate, something to sell tickets for. But to me it was pressure, volume, gravity, and timing. And those are not things you can negotiate with. They are things you either respect or you pay for. And as the last light dropped behind the trees and the generators finally powered down for the night, leaving the water unnaturally still around that platform, I knew exactly where this was heading, not because I wanted it to, but because they had already set every variable in motion, and all I had to do now was decide when to let the system respond. By Friday morning the lake sounded wrong again. Too quiet near the platform and too active along the edges, like all the motion had been pushed outward where nobody was paying attention. And I walked the damn road just after sunrise with a thermos of black coffee cooling in my hand, gravel crunching under my boots in that slow, steady rhythm that always helped me think, and every step brought back muscle memory from years of maintenance checks. The angle of the slope, the way the grass thinned near the concrete face, the faint metallic scent that only shows up when machinery has been sitting idle too long. And when I reached the control housing I paused for a second with my hand on the door, feeling that low hum of contained pressure through the metal, like a heartbeat waiting for a signal. And inside, everything was exactly how I left it. Gauges steady, valves locked, indicators calm. The entire system holding millions of gallons in perfect balance because that is what it was designed to do. And I set the thermos down and ran my fingers along the primary control wheel, not turning it yet, just feeling the resistance built into it, the weight of what it controlled, and I could still hear Victoria's voice from the previous afternoon echoing in my head. That same confident tone when she told a small crowd on the shoreline that this was just the beginning, that the community deserved amenities like this, that the lake had been underutilized for years, and the way people nodded along with her like ownership could be voted into existence if enough people agreed. And that was the moment I understood something clearly. They were not planning to ask, they were planning to normalize it, to build just enough momentum that by the time anyone challenged it the structure would already feel permanent. And I took a slow breath and stepped back outside, looking down toward the waterline where the platform sat anchored and quiet now in the early light. And I imagined it filled with people, glasses clinking, music playing, unaware of what was holding them up, and the thought was not satisfying the way you might expect. It was just precise, like solving a problem that had only one correct answer. And I walked back along the crest of the dam, stopping at the spillway where a thin, controlled trickle slipped through, the sound soft but constant, and I knelt down and watched the flow for a long moment, calculating again, because this was not about force, it was about timing, about knowing exactly how long it would take for a controlled release to lower the level without triggering alarms or drawing attention until it was too late to reverse, and I had done that. Math before in different conditions, flood prevention, seasonal adjustments, emergency testing, but never like this, never with an outcome that depended on human arrogance as much as physics. And later that afternoon I drove into town and passed the banner hanging across Main Street announcing the grand opening. Bright colors, bold letters, a schedule printed down to the minute like they had already mastered every variable. And people were talking about it in line at the hardware store, excited, curious, already planning where they would sit. And I just listened without saying a word, because explaining it would not change anything, not at this stage, and by the time the sun dropped again and the last preparations wrapped up on the water, I knew exactly when everything would begin and exactly how long I needed to let it run. And as the lights came on across the platform that night, reflecting perfectly across a surface they assumed would stay exactly where it was, I stood back at the control house one more time. The air cooler now, the smell of damp soil rising as temperatures dropped, and I rested my hand on that same control wheel, not moving it yet, just feeling the quiet certainty settle in, because they had built something that depended entirely on a condition they did not control, and in a few hours, neither would the lake. At exactly 4:17 a.m., the world felt suspended in that quiet space before something changes, the kind of silence where even the smallest sound carries farther than it should, and I stood inside the control housing with my hand wrapped around the steel wheel, the metal cold and slightly damp from the night air, feeling the resistance built into it like it was asking one last time if I was sure, and outside the lake was still, perfectly still, reflecting the lights from that platform in a way that almost made it look permanent, like it had always been there, like it belonged. And that illusion was the most dangerous part of all of it, because water can make anything look stable right up until the moment it is not. And I took a slow breath and turned the wheel, just a fraction at first, listening as the system responded with a low mechanical groan that echoed through the concrete, like something waking up after a long sleep. And then came the sound I knew better than anything, the controlled rush beginning deep inside the structure. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, precise, like a clock starting its countdown. And I watched the gauge needle shift by a hair, then another, confirming what I already knew. The release had started, and from here on out everything would move exactly according to the physics that had been written into this place decades ago. Not by them, not by any committee or board, but by design and gravity and time. And I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, the cool air hitting my face as the faint sound of moving water grew just enough to register if you were paying attention, which nobody was, not at this hour, not with the grand opening still hours away, and I walked down toward the shoreline again, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground, feeling that subtle shift underfoot that most people would never notice, the way the edge begins to change before the surface tells the story. And out on the platform everything remained quiet. Empty tables set in neat rows, chairs aligned perfectly, glassware catching the early light, all of it waiting for a moment that was already slipping away inch by inch, gallon by gallon. And I checked my watch, doing the math in my head, calculating the drop rate against surface area, the timing against sunrise and arrival schedules, and it was all lining up exactly the way I expected, slow enough to go unnoticed at first, fast enough that by the time anyone realized what was happening there would be no simple fix, no quick adjustment. Just a system doing exactly what it was designed to do under conditions they had created without understanding. And I moved along the edge of the lake, watching the water line against a cluster of rocks I had known since I was a kid. And there it was, the first visible change, barely an inch lower, something only someone like me would catch. But it was enough to confirm that everything was in motion now. And I felt that calm settle in deeper, not satisfaction, not excitement, just certainty, because this was never about destroying anything. It was about removing the one assumption they had built everything on. And as the sky began to lighten and the first sounds of morning drifted in from the distance, birds cutting through the air, a truck starting somewhere down the road, I knew that by the time the first guests stepped onto that platform later today, the lake they thought they understood would no longer be the same. And there would be no stopping what had already been set in motion. By 7:32 a.m. the lake was already telling the truth, just not loudly enough for anyone but me to hear it. And I stood near the same line of rocks watching the water slip lower in a way that looked natural if you did not know what it was supposed to look like. The surface still smooth, still reflecting the sky, but the edges beginning to expose details that had not seen daylight in years, darker soil, uneven contours, the kind of subtle shift that only matters when something depends on stability. And out in the center the platform still floated, still looked perfect from a distance, but I could see the difference in how it sat. just a fraction lower on one side, the weight distribution, starting to adjust to a level that was no longer consistent, and I checked my watch again, doing the math automatically, the rate holding steady, exactly where it needed to be, and that was when the first truck rolled in, tires crunching on gravel behind me, followed by another, and then a line of vehicles bringing staff, supplies, early arrivals. All of them focused on the schedule printed on that banner like it was something that could not change, and I stepped back into the tree line, out of their direct view, not hiding, just observing, because this part mattered, the moment when everything looks fine right before it is not, and I could hear voices carrying across the water now, light, excited, the kind of tone people use when they think they are about to experience something new, something exclusive, and Victoria's voice rose above the rest, confident, controlled, giving instructions, coordinating timing, making sure everything aligned with the plan she believed in. And for a second, I almost respected the precision of it, the way she had organized all of this without ever questioning the one variable that made it possible. And I walked a little farther along the edge, stopping at a wooden post where I used to tie a small boat years ago, and the rope marks were still there. But now they sat inches higher above the waterline than they should have been, a quiet marker of change that nobody else was looking for. And I ran my hand along the worn wood, feeling the grooves, remembering how consistent that level used to be, how predictable, and now it was shifting minute by minute, and still nobody noticed, because from the platform everything probably felt the same, gentle. Movement, soft waves, nothing alarming, just enough motion to remind you that you were on water, and I watched as staff began setting up final details, adjusting table settings, aligning chairs, placing glasses in perfect symmetry, all of it built on an assumption that the surface beneath them would hold exactly as expected, and I could see the anchoring lines stretched tight now, angles changing slightly as the level dropped, tension building in ways they had not accounted for, and that was the part most people miss. The way small changes compound quietly until they reach a point where correction is no longer simple. And the sun climbed higher, warming the air, bringing more people, more movement, more noise, and still the water kept moving, slipping away in a steady controlled release that did not care about schedules or announcements. And I checked the rocks again, then the shoreline farther down, confirming the drop was accelerating just enough as surface area decreased. Exactly like the model predicted. And I felt that same calm settle in again, not because something was about to happen, but because it was already happening, already too far along to stop without drawing attention they could not control. And out on the platform, I saw Victoria step to the edge, looking out across the lake like she was taking ownership of the view. And for a moment her posture shifted, just slightly, like she sensed something was off without knowing what. And that was the first crack, not in the structure, not in the system, but in certainty. And once that starts, everything else follows. By 9:18 a.m. the illusion was still holding, but only if you were not looking for the right details. And I stood farther up the ridge now, where I could see the entire lake basin in one frame, the platform, the shoreline, the slow widening band of exposed earth creeping outward like a shadow that did not belong. And the sound had changed too. The water no longer carried that full-bodied stillness. Instead, there was a faint, hollow echo to it, like the surface was stretched thinner than it should be. And that is when I saw the first real adjustment on the platform itself, subtle but undeniable. One corner dipping just enough that a row of chairs had been shifted without anyone announcing it, staff moving quickly but casually, correcting something they did not fully understand, and I could almost hear the thought process from here. Small issue, minor correction, nothing to delay the schedule, because delay was the one thing they could not afford now that people were arriving in waves, cars lining the access road, guests stepping out in summer clothes, sunglasses catching the light, all of them walking toward that structure with the kind of confidence that comes from believing everything has already been handled. And I watched as Victoria moved through them, greeting, directing, controlling the narrative with every word, her posture still strong but tighter now, like she was compensating for something she could not quite identify. And down at the shoreline, the waterline had pulled back far enough to expose a strip of dark mud that glistened under the sun, something that should not have been visible this close to midday. And a few people noticed it. I could see them pause, glance down, hesitate for just a second before continuing forward, because nobody wants to be the first one to question something that looks official, and I checked the timing again. The release still steady. The drop now accelerating just enough that the visual change was becoming harder to ignore. And out on the platform, the anchoring lines were no longer symmetrical, angles pulling unevenly as the water level shifted beneath them, creating a tension that translated into movement you could feel if you were standing on it. A slight lean, a subtle tilt, nothing dramatic, but enough to disrupt the perfect balance they had designed for a level surface that no longer existed. And that is when I saw Victoria step toward the edge again, this time not to admire the view, but to look down, really look, her head tilting slightly, her body pausing in a way that broke her usual rhythm, and even from this distance I could tell the certainty was cracking wider now, because she turned and said something sharp to one of the staff. A quick exchange, a glance back at the water, and then another. Adjustment on the platform, tables shifted, alignment corrected, like they could fix a system by rearranging the surface, and I felt that same calm settle deeper in my chest, because this was the moment where recognition begins but control is already gone, and the lake kept responding the only way it knows how, lowering, revealing, changing shape in real time, and the platform followed that change whether they wanted it to or not, settling incrementally, the gap between expectation and reality, widening with every passing minute. And as the sun climbed higher and the crowd grew thicker, the energy shifted, excitement mixing with something quieter, something uncertain, and I knew that within the next stretch of time, not long now, the difference would become impossible to ignore, not because anything dramatic would happen all at once, but because everything would stop aligning with what they believed was supposed to happen. And once that alignment breaks, there is no way to hide it. Not from a crowd, not from a system, and definitely not from the water they never controlled. By 10:47 a.m. the shift was no longer subtle. It was visible from every angle if you were willing to admit it, and I could feel the change in the air itself as conversations grew uneven, laughter cutting off mid-sentence, the kind of small social fractures that happen when reality stops matching expectation. And from where I stood, the lake had pulled back far enough that the platform no longer looked like it belonged out there. It looked stranded, suspended over something that was steadily disappearing beneath it, and the waterline had retreated yards now, not inches, exposing wide stretches of dark, wet ground that reflected the sunlight in broken patterns instead of smooth glass. And I watched as guests began to notice in clusters, pointing, whispering, stepping more carefully as they moved across the entrance ramp, which now angled differently than it had just an hour before, a detail too obvious to ignore. And on the platform itself the balance had shifted enough that every adjustment they made only highlighted the problem instead of hiding it. Chairs no longer sitting flat, table edges catching the light at uneven angles, glasses sliding just slightly before being corrected, over and over again. And Victoria was moving faster now, her steps sharper, her voice tighter as she tried to maintain control over something that was already beyond it, issuing instructions that focused on surface fixes, reposition this, stabilize that, keep the schedule moving, because stopping would mean acknowledging what was happening, and acknowledging it would mean admitting they never had control in the first place. And I could see the staff exchanging looks now, quick, uncertain glances that said more than words ever could, because they were the ones closest to it, the ones who could feel the structure responding to something they did not understand, and the anchoring lines had shifted into visible tension, pulling at angles that made the platform sit unevenly, one side dipping just enough that movement across it required constant correction, and the crowd energy had changed completely. Excitement replaced by curiosity, then concern, phones coming out not to capture something impressive but to document something unexpected, and I checked the shoreline again, confirming what I already knew. The drop rate had reached the point where recovery was no longer an option, not in real time, not with this system, and I felt that same steady calm settle deeper, because this was not chaos. It was precision unfolding exactly as designed, every inch of water that left the basin revealing the truth they had built over. And I remembered the first time my grandfather showed me how the lake responded to release, how he explained that you do not fight water, you guide it. You let it follow the path it was always going to take. And standing there watching the platform settle lower, the gap between it and the receding surface growing more obvious with every passing minute, I understood that lesson more clearly than ever. Because this was not something I was forcing, this was something They had triggered the moment they assumed the system would stay static, and out on the platform Victoria finally stopped moving for a second, just stood there at the edge again, looking down at the exposed ground that should have been covered, her posture no longer confident but calculating, searching for a solution that did not exist, and even from this distance I could see it, the realization beginning to form, not fully there yet, but close enough that everything she said next would be shaped by it. And as the sun climbed higher and the crowd shifted further away from the center of the platform toward the edges, drawn by instinct to stability, I knew that the moment of undeniable clarity was coming, not as a single event, but as a convergence of small truths that could no longer be ignored. And when that happens, no announcement can fix it, no adjustment can hide it, because the system has already answered the question they never thought to ask. By 11:06 a.m., the moment finally broke, not with a single loud event, but with a series of small, undeniable truths stacking on top of each other until nobody could pretend anymore. And I watched from the ridge as the platform settled into a position it was never designed to hold, the front edge now visibly lower than the back. The clean symmetry they had spent days perfecting replaced by a subtle but constant tilt that affected everything on it, glasses no longer staying centered, chairs needing to be adjusted every few minutes, people shifting their weight without realizing why, and the crowd energy changed completely, conversations turning into questions turning into quiet concern, and I could see guests stepping off the platform more frequently now, choosing solid ground over something that felt uncertain. And that is when the sound changed again, not dramatic, just different. A faint scraping undertone carried through the air as parts of the structure made contact with something beneath, something that should have been covered by water. And that was the point where explanation became impossible, because no amount of planning accounts for the ground itself showing up where it should not be. And Victoria knew it. I could see it in the way she moved now, no longer directing with confidence, but reacting, her steps quicker, her gestures sharper, calling people over, pointing toward the waterline that had now retreated far enough to expose wide patches of lake bed stretching toward the center. And even from this distance I could tell she was doing the math in her head, trying to understand how something that looked stable just hours ago could change this much this fast. And the answer was simple. It was never stable. It was just supported by something she did not control. And I walked a few steps down the slope, closer to the shoreline, watching as the exposed ground darkened and cracked, slightly under the sun, the surface no longer reflecting light but absorbing it, turning what used to be a lake into something that looked temporary, unfinished, and the platform now sat unevenly above it, anchored to a condition that no longer existed. And people had their phones out now, not for celebration but for documentation, capturing the shift, the tilt, the exposed earth, the entire scene transforming in real time into something that could not be ignored or explained away. And I could hear fragments of conversation carried on the wind, words like unstable, draining, something is wrong, and those words spread faster than any announcement ever could, moving through the crowd until the entire atmosphere changed. And I checked the shoreline markers again, confirming what I already knew. The level had dropped far enough that even if they tried to intervene now, it would not matter. The system had already moved past the point of correction, and I felt no urgency, no need to rush or step in, because this was not about confrontation. It was about consequence unfolding exactly as it was supposed to. And out on the platform, Victoria finally stopped trying to fix it, just stood there looking out across what used to be open water and was now a widening stretch of exposed ground, her posture rigid, her silence louder than anything she had said all morning. And in that moment, everything aligned, the design, the timing, the release, the assumption they had built everything on, collapsing not in chaos but in clarity, because there was no single point to argue against, no one decision to blame, just a system responding to reality. And as the platform settled a little further, the angle becoming undeniable, the last pieces of doubt disappeared from the crowd, replaced by understanding. And once people understand something like this, once they see it with their own eyes, there is no reversing it, no explaining it away, no reclaiming control over a situation that was never truly theirs to begin with. By 11:22 a.m. the lake was no longer a lake in any way that mattered to them, and I stood at the edge of what used to be 30 feet of water now reduced to a broad stretch of exposed earth that carried the faint smell of damp soil warming under the sun. The surface uneven, textured, real in a way that water never is, and out in the middle the platform had stopped pretending altogether, no longer floating but resting, tilted just enough to make its purpose impossible to ignore, a structure designed for motion now held in place by the absence of it, and the crowd had thinned to the perimeter, people stepping back, choosing distance over uncertainty, their voices quieter now, more measured, the kind of tone that comes after realization settles in, and I could see phones still raised, capturing the final state of something that had changed too quickly for anyone to control, and Victoria stood near the edge of the platform, not moving, not directing, just looking out across the exposed lakebed like she was trying to find the exact moment where her certainty had slipped away, and I walked a few steps closer along the shoreline, boots pressing into ground that had not felt weight in years, each step steady, deliberate, the way my grandfather used to walk when he inspected this place. And I could feel the system still working behind me, the distant controlled flow continuing its quiet release, doing exactly what it was built to do without hesitation or negotiation. And that was the part nobody else could hear, the part that mattered more than anything happening in front of them. Because this was never about the platform, or the crowd, or the event. It was about the one assumption everything depended on, that the surface would stay where they expected it to be. And once that assumption was gone, everything else followed, and I stopped near one of the old shoreline markers, now sitting feet above the current level, a simple piece of wood that measured truth better than any announcement ever could. And I rested my hand against it, feeling the rough grain, the quiet history in it. And I thought about all the times this lake had changed before, storms, droughts, seasons, always responding to forces that did not care about plans or schedules. And this was no different, just more precise, more intentional, guided instead of resisted, and out on the platform a final adjustment attempt played out, staff moving something, repositioning weight, but it did not matter anymore. The foundation they needed was gone, replaced by something they could not work with, and I saw Victoria finally step off, her posture no longer controlled but contained, like she understood there was nothing left to direct, and for a moment our lines of sight met across that distance, not close enough for words, not necessary for them either, because everything that needed to be said was already visible in the space between us, the exposed ground, the tilted structure, the quiet system still running behind it all. And I felt no need to speak, no need to explain, because this was not a victory you announce. It was one you let settle, the same way the water had settled away from them, revealing what was always underneath. And as the crowd continued to drift back toward the road, the energy dissolving into something quieter, something reflective, I turned slightly and looked back toward the control house on the ridge, knowing exactly how this would be understood once the details caught up, once permits were reviewed, once questions were asked about flow diversion and structural dependency. And that was when the final clarity set in. Simple, steady, undeniable. They had built something that only worked if the water stayed, and I had never promised it would.